Welcome back. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our final proposal of the conference and welcome Professor Fiona Scott Morton, who is going to moderate this session. Fiona is the Theodore Nierenberg Professor of Economics at Yale University School of Management. She's a research associate at the NBER, and she has degrees from Yale and MIT. She served as the chief economist of the Antitrust Division of the US Department of Justice under President Obama, and is currently helping to run a digital platform initiative at Yale University. Fiona, welcome.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope all of you out there watching are going to enjoy this final panel. I'm really pleased to welcome our proposer, Deborah Raji. Deb is a computer scientist and an activist who focuses on algorithmic bias, auditing, and accountability. She's a fellow at the Mozilla Foundation, researching algorithmic evaluation, and also at the Algorithmic Justice League, where she researches gender and racial bias in facial recognition technology. She has also worked with Google's ethical AI team and been a research fellow at the Partnership on AI and AI Now Institute at New York University, where she studied how to operationalize ethical considerations in machine learning engineering practice. She's now a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley. Today, Deb will discuss AI accountability and how to create a pathway for third-party auditors to ensure that AI doesn't cause harm to society. This is obviously a fantastic topic, and we're really looking forward to hearing from Deb. Deb, welcome, and please share your screen when you're ready.
Awesome, thank you so much. Let me spend a second. Okay.
That's good.
All right, we're good. All right, so hi, I'm Deb. Sorry, one second. And I'm here to talk about a proposal for algorithmic accountability, fostering an AI ecosystem for third-party participation. Sorry, one second, there's something on my screen. Let me just adjust that really quickly before I continue. And I want to start the conversation with really spotlighting who, third-party auditors are most concerned about and just the perspective coming from that angle. So this is Josiah Elston Burrell. He is one of many students impacted by the algorithm that was deployed by the UK government to address the fact that students can sit for their final A-level exam, so they used an algorithm to adjust their final grades. And in the case of Josiah, that adjusted his grade in his Mandarin course from an A to a C, thus jeopardizing his ability to enter university that year. This is Tammy Dobbs, and she is...
Sorry to interrupt. I don't think we're seeing your slides advance.
Oh? You're not seeing the slides at all?
Yeah.
Oh, it's showing the first slide still.
Oh. Okay, should I reshare? Should I reshare the slides? Let's
please try resharing that.
Okay, let me stop sharing and share again.
It might be, Deb, that seeing the list down the edge, the left-hand edge, is necessary to see the advancing. Do you have two screens in front of you?
No, I have one screen. I'm on a single laptop. Can you see this is the second slide?
No.
First slide.
No. Okay. This is interesting.
Maybe go back before you do slideshow, go back to where we can see the whole screen. Now try.
I should try play?
No. Now move to the next slide. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I can't, I won't be able to, when I do this, like you didn't see the change in the slide happening right now.
Correct. I'm looking at Josiah Elston Burrell.
Oh, okay. That's unfortunate. I guess one option is I could also export to a PDF and play it immediately. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
Well, if you don't have animations, I think you could just click through this way. Do you have animations?
Oh, I don't have animations. I guess
I think if you just click through this way, that works fine.
Okay,
let's do that.
Okay, let's do that. Okay. So this is Tammy Dobbs, and she experienced a similar sort of form of algorithmic harm where because of an algorithm, she's a disabled woman that lives in Arkansas and in need of nurse care under Medicaid, and the allotted amount of nurse care hours were cut in half for her because of an algorithmic glitch. And this is Robert Williams, who was wrongfully arrested because of a false facial recognition match. So we actually have a lot of these situations where you have these algorithmic deployments impacting, many, many people, and the actual individual harm experienced is very serious consequences. So, this is an older case from 2016. Michigan tried to develop the Midas unemployment algorithm to sort of just flag cases of unemployment fraud applications, and in at least 20,000 cases, wrongfully accused individuals of unemployment fraud. One of those individuals was Brian Russell, who, due to that false accusation, had to file for bankruptcy and was only cleared by the state of the false charges 2 years later. We also see a similar sort of pattern in tenant screening algorithms that are notorious for being unbelievably inaccurate. So Devon Jackson was falsely flagged by an algorithm as having an arrest record and thus denied for low-income housing in Tennessee. And as a result, was forced to live in a small motel room with his 9-year-old daughter for nearly a year. We see a similar thing with the infamous Stanford vaccination rollout plan and algorithm, which allocated only 7 of 5,000 available doses to frontline house staff. And Nuriel, who was very vocal about this issue online, declared that he had to go to another hospital to get vaccination in order to protect himself, his family, and his patients. So these headlines are becoming more and more common, where we see these algorithms failing in particular for certain underrepresented groups. And these headlines just keep continuing, and the damage being done is becoming increasingly clear. I think sometimes when people think about AI, broadly speaking, or it's similar to the way that they talk about robotics. In robotics, a lot of people, the public thinks a lot about, Sophia the robot type robots that are very humanoid, bipedal robots, very complicated looking and very impressive looking. When in reality, the real way that robotics has influenced their lives so far has been through something like a Roomba, deployed in about 1 million homes. The Roomba is the most widely deployed robot in the country right now. And it's a much simpler device, a much less complicated looking device, but it impacts their personal lives in very small ways. So in AI, although we like to talk about this vision of AI and the sort of complex sci-fi reality of what we think the technology can do, the reality is that we're dealing with a lot of these Roomba algorithms. They're very simple and they impact lives in very sort of pernicious and difficult to detect small ways, but they're quite impactful as a result of that fact, and the fact that they impact so many people and they're so widespread. And unfortunately, what we're seeing, as with any built artifact, you end up with accidents, you end up with these car crash situations where these systems fail. And in particular with algorithms, we're seeing them fail disproportionately for a particular segment of the population. And once you have a system crashing or failing for a segment of the population, there needs to be this question of accountability. Is there something about the way that this artifact was built that caused this failure? And as a result, who is responsible for making changes or the decision-making that contributed to this outcome? So this is where external third-party audits become an interesting mechanism for algorithmic accountability to consider. So to describe just what I mean by external third-party audits, these are the sort of types of algorithmic auditors that have no contractual relationship to the audit target. So an internal auditor might be sort of an internal responsible innovation team at let's say a tech company, so Microsoft or Google, or it might be a contracted consultant, so Accenture or Orca, and they have direct access to the system. They're looking at the system pre-deployment, and they're often very concerned about compliance to external regulation or quality control, interests that align with the corporate interests. Whereas external auditors are regulators like the FDA or NIST, the Markup or other investigative journalism groups like ProPublica, civil society groups like HAL or ACLU, or law firms. And what they're interested in is their representatives and the interest and protecting the interests of their representatives and collecting evidence for concerns related to their represented groups. And these third-party auditors are looking at the system post-deployment, often dealing with complaints after the system's already been released out there, and they're not given access to the system typically. So they only have consumer level or indirect access to the system. An example of what an internal audit might look like is the SMACTR framework used in Google, where it's an independent team within the organization at Google, sort of assessing how different decisions throughout the engineering development process align with Google's high-level principles or Google's obligations in terms of liability. And that differs a lot from an audit like Gender Shades, for example. So Gender Shades was an external audit done by Joy Bulamwini and Timnit Gebru. And what it was looking at was the performance of commercial facial recognition tools on different demographic subgroups. And what they found was that a lot of these deployed systems failed disproportionately for the darker female subgroup. And they had no contractual relationship with any of those organizations, so they kind of constitute and play that role of external auditor. So when we think about the different components of an audit can really be summarized as having two components. One, really looking at the evaluation and the assessment of the tool, and the other more focused on accountability. So Gender Shades, looking again at Gender Shades, what are the sort of design components of Gender Shades? So Gender Shades, one of the sort of key contributions of that paper was the fact that in comparison to all the other mainstream facial recognition data sets at the time, the PPB benchmark used in Gender Shades was much more balanced with respect to representation for male and female and darker and lighter subjects. And as a result, they were able to sort of assess performance on these intersectional subgroups. And following Gender Shades, there has been other external audits done by the ACLU, Big Brother Watch UK, which is a civil society group in the UK, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, sort of doing other evaluations of the same types of systems and asking similar questions of those systems. So the evaluation component is super critical to what defines an audit. And beyond the facial recognition space, we have other really great examples of these very creative evaluations to really assess and provide evidence for particular concerns expressed by a certain community. So here you have, the markup has done multiple great audits looking at, the percentage of search results coming from a particular source from Google search engines. And then here's the audit for the A-level algorithms. So there's all these evaluations that occur in order to be able to ask questions about how well these systems are actually working and who they're actually working for. And this evaluation component of the audit sort of complements the second part, where it's not just about getting to sort of description of who the system is failing for and how it's failing, but also thinking about accountability and how to translate that evaluation into an actual accountability outcome. So in the case of Gender Shades, because of the audit result, they were able to get a corporate response. There were other design decisions made that made the sort of project very visible in a way that garnered a corporate response. So they named multiple targets, and as a result of that, it kind of launched the study into the press in a way that garnered reactions from all the different companies that were audited, specifically the audit targets. And within 7 months of the release of the study, all the audit targets had updated their system. So Microsoft, and you can see specifically that they updated performance specifically on the darker female subgroup. So if you look at Microsoft, Face++, and IBM, the year after they were audited by Gender Shades, they had made updates to their product. So Gender Shades led to sort of a lot of public outcry and product updates, but there's also a lot of nationwide regulatory changes on facial recognition that were inspired by this, this particular audit. In addition to that, the audits that it inspired, led by NIST and ACLU, all led to this voluntary recall, where a lot of the companies that were audited by Gender Shades in the subsequent studies, so this is Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft in particular, stated that they would have these, they would sort of engage in a voluntary moratorium of the sale of their facial recognition technology to police. And then similarly, other external audits, such as that of the markup, has led to congressional hearings. And then Foxglove's audit of the A-level algorithm actually led to the the recall of the use of that algorithm that particular year after they filed several lawsuits. So all this to say, external audits are a very effective mechanism to hold stakeholders accountable when they release or design or develop algorithms that are negatively impacting the lives of real people. So again, sort of who is conducting these audits? The range of third-party auditors is pretty vast. So you have academics, civil society, journalists, law firms, regulators, and here's just a couple names of specifically who I'm talking about. But all of these sort of fall under the range of people participating in this third-party audit work at this moment right now, trying to hold these tech companies accountable for the algorithms that they develop and release into the world. And in addition to different institutions accountable for how they make use of these algorithms. So, what is difficult about being an auditor? What are the specific challenges? What makes it really hard to play this third-party audit role? If it's such an effective mechanism for algorithmic accountability, why don't more people do it? So one issue is that of access. After we had audited Kairos, which is a facial recognition startup, they immediately put up this paywall. And not only did they put up the paywall, but because they used to have a freemium sort of tier. But after they had put up the paywall, if we wanted to be able to access their system in order to be able to audit it, they actually had a whole terms of service clause in there that was sort of dissuading or discouraging the use of the API for the sake of audit activity. So that kind of reaction to the potential of being audited is pretty common in the tech space now. In fact, Julia Angwin from the Markup recently led this campaign with the Markup on scraping is not a crime, where a lot of the times third-party auditors, because they're not given direct access to the system, will have to, scrape different platforms or think creatively about how to crowdsource information, and thus be sort of vulnerable to retaliation by these tech companies that do not want to be inspected, that do not want to have their algorithms inspected, and they'll leverage everything from anti-hacking laws to privacy laws to try to sort of discourage or actively dissuade these third-party auditors from collecting the information that they need to do their evaluations. So here you can see, Julia Angwin sort of advocating for updates to the anti-hacking law CFAA in order to protect data journalists and those doing this sort of external accountability work. And we've seen Facebook recently go after an external audit team at NYU that was attempting to audit the news feed for political ad targeting. They also went after Algorithm Watch that was looking at the Instagram algorithm. And similarly, Clearview AI challenged a lot of watchdogs that were attempting to scrutinize their systems. So you can see again, this sort of repeated opportunity that companies have to really attack companies leveraging sort of anti-hacking and privacy laws. So, but we have had some wins. So here's Sandvig and Barr, which was sort of a critical case in federal court, where they said that big data discrimination studies could be exempt from federal anti-hacking laws. However, this ruling is not necessarily law, and thus those that engage in this third-party work are still really vulnerable to these legal attacks. So aside from access, what are the other issues or the other challenges involved in third-party auditing? So one is harms discovery. So harms discovery is really this challenge of the fact that it can be really difficult to identify a target and to know what to audit for, either in terms of like which vendor, which company to audit for, or exactly, identifying the algorithms within a broader ecosystem of something that might be impacting someone. So for example, if a renter gets denied rent, understanding how the algorithm factors into that result is very difficult and very tricky to detect from the outside. But even if you do somehow find out that that an algorithm is part of the process that negatively impacted you, who do you contact and how do you contact them? So that's always been a challenge in terms of third-party accountability work, a lot of the way in which we find things out is very ad hoc. So for example, with Robert Williams, he overheard a police officer talking about facial recognition, had recently read about the racial discrepancy in performance for those systems and was able to make that match and communicate that. But very rarely does that happen. And then the sort of final challenge is that of audit impact. So after you have executed the audit and you want to sort of understand how it intersects with sort of a broader process of accountability, it's really important to reflect on how to actually get the audit results to result in the impact that you want to see. So Gender Shades was very effective in terms of getting to product updates for the 3 companies that were called out explicitly in that audit, but other companies like Amazon and Kairos, which were not explicitly audited, but were selling the same product in the same industry, still had large discrepancies between the darker female and lighter male subgroup. And we can see this repeated in follow-up studies as well, where you can only really target a specific demographic group, prediction task, or company. It's very, very difficult to get the audit to be visible to every single actor that you want to influence. You have very little control over the audit target response as well. So a company can react however way they see fit. There's no sort of mandate on how exactly they're going to react. If they're going to react in the magnitude that you need them to. So it's very little control over exactly what the audit target response is going to be. And that makes it very challenging to translate the evaluation to accountability. So these are the 3 challenges, and the 3 solutions that we're sort of hoping to bring forward are around this idea of an audit oversight board, a national incident reporting system, and a post-audit interventions. So the Auditor Oversight Board is this idea of, in order to provide protected access to accredited third-party AI auditors, we can instantiate this Audit Oversight Board. So we already have regulators within federal agencies, FTC, FDA, that have inspection powers. For example, the FTC under Article 6B has the ability to be able to demand information from certain firms under investigation. FDA similarly can have mandated requests for information, legal immunity if they're attacked for access. But these regulators sort of lack the capacity, the expertise, and the level of awareness that other third-party auditors have. So why not extend these powers to other qualified third-party auditors? So the audit board can be within one of these agencies or be in its own independent institution. But the idea being that the audit board can mandate access privileges, and it can also mediate sort of disputes between the auditor and the auditee. The other kind of interesting thing about the audit board is that it can oversee a vetting process to assess independence and qualifications for the auditor. And the kind of analogy for this is the Algorithmic Justice League has sort of started this Audit the Auditors project, where it's a survey of those that currently identify as algorithmic auditors. And they've done a good job sort of indexing the different sort of qualifications that different stakeholders have within this ecosystem. In the medical device space, there's this idea of auditing organizations under the Medical Device Single Audit Program. And these are organizations that are sort of appointed by the health department of a particular government. So this is Health Canada or the FDA. And they will sort of collectively decide on standards for practice amongst themselves and be able to sort of execute, operationally execute on the audit work required for medical device surveillance. And then in finance, you have SEC's sort of GAP principles and the international sort of version of that, in addition to an audit standards board from the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, again, sort of standardizing audit practice and then mediating the access to privileges and to certain powers as auditors. So the sort of second solution or second sort of path forward is this idea of a national incident reporting system. So the idea of a national incident reporting system is really for the goal of getting logged records of complaints for AI harms discovery. So those that are most aware of these harms have the least capacity to take action on it. We sort of need a centralized local database to sort of log and organize complaints and known cases of algorithmic harm reported by third parties, including the public. And this in the database can't sort of like live by itself. It sort of requires complementary legislation, thinking about the disclosure of algorithmic use by federal agencies as an accessible reference for complaints. So if someone suspects that they've been impacted by an algorithm, they should have the reference of all the algorithms being used in a particular context. Also, there should be some required communication and notice of use during bureaucratic processes involving public agencies. So for example, if you were part of a criminal investigation and you suspect that, as part of the criminal investigation, a risk assessment had been used, you would be sort of notified of the use of that risk assessment so that you would be in a position to be able to file a complaint if you suspected that there was something wrong about the use of that tool. So notice of use and disclosure are sort of complementary policies to this idea of an incident reporting system. And then of course, this idea of repeat offenders on the, one of the sort of benefits of having this logged database is that repeat offenders in the database can be fined and flagged. So if there's a company that gets flagged repeatedly or a particular feature or product that gets flagged repeatedly, then that could trigger an investigation and that company could be fined just for being flagged so many times. And these fines can fund, bounties or contracts to incentivize third-party auditors to investigate particular repeated issues, repeated complaints. And there's lots of analogies here. I'm not sure if I have time to go through all of them, but it's pretty much a very common practice. We have in the AI space, a couple of these. The Partnership on AI developed an AI incident database, and there's this tool called Algorithm Tips that is used a lot in investigative journalism. Algorithmic Justice League ourselves, we have an intake form, and there's a lot of people that contact us through these forms to try to communicate issues that they've experienced in terms of algorithmic harm. And in the medical device space, the FDA has medical device incident databases and adverse event reporting systems. Transportation has, especially the aviation space has a lot of these incident reporting systems. Same with security and finance. And then sort of the final sort of pillar of this proposal is this idea of a post-audit intervention. So, the first two interventions are really to address the issues of access and harms discovery, which are very tied to how well we do the evaluations of an audit. But the sort of last pillar is this idea of, well, how do you translate those evaluations into accountability outcomes? So we need some post-audit interventions to be sort of integrated into the policy agenda. And these are regulatory measures for audit impact or to garner a particular audit response. And that means having these audits feed directly into enforcement, standard setting, and reporting. And what this means is direct communication channels between auditors and enforcement agencies, auditors setting industry-wide standards for AI development and deployment, and then also some level of public reporting and centralized access to a repository of audit reports. So the analogies here is that in AI, we had the IEEE P7013 sort of standard, which was directly developed in response to gender shades. In environmental health and safety audits, there's a lot of direct enforcement and legal reporting powers given to third-party auditors that can definitely be ported into the algorithmic space. And then in finance, there's the Edgar database and other resources to figure out which company has been audited by who and facilitate public access to audit reports. So in conclusion, those most likely to be harmed are those the most vulnerable within society and often the least informed and the least involved in AI development, and traditionally have been those with the least recourse in terms of getting to justice. And when we empower third-party auditors, we actually empower these people to be able to challenge, identify, and address algorithmic harm impacting their lives. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Deb. That was great. We will now be joined by our panelists. DJ Patil is a mathematician and data scientist, a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, a board member of Devoted Health, and an advisor to Venrock Partners. He was also the first US chief data scientist, where he helped shape digital policy. Cathy O'Neill is a mathematician, data scientist, and author of the best-selling book, Weapons of Math Destruction, a great title. She also recently founded Orca, an algorithmic auditing company. Welcome, DJ and Cathy. I am going to begin by asking each of you to react to Deb's talk, and I thought I'd start us off with Cathy. Why don't I just give you a few minutes to give your reactions? We'll turn it over to DJ, and then we'll have more of a free flow discussion.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, I really appreciate Deb's perspective of third-party auditors, and I know she was very active and is very active in this space, and it's an incredibly important perspective. I come at it from a slightly different perspective, and I should start by saying I do auditing, but I think by Deb's definition, some of it's second party in the sense that I get hired by companies to audit their algorithms internally. And then some of it's third party because I work with attorney generals in 4 different states on auditing systems and processes and algorithms for mostly consumer products in finance. And so I have the perspective of both of those, but I do not have the perspective in particular from the sort of journalist markup and even the gender shades perspective, which is to say kind of an adversarial audit where you actually have to somehow collect the data yourself. And that's an incredibly important issue. I mean, I guess the reason I chose this field is because I knew that there were algorithms that no journalist, no activist could ever audit, that were so internal and so invisible and so inaccessible that the only way to actually audit them would be to have access to the internal data. So I'm talking about things like how much should someone pay for, pay interest on a loan, or what should the premium be on an insurance product type thing. And to that point, I think what I want to say is that it's very important to me. I became an auditor in some sense because I wanted to try to prevent the field of auditing algorithms, which I anticipated was going to be inevitable. I wanted to prevent this field from becoming as corrupt as I consider the field is in finance, and in particular, the mortgage-backed security risk assessments of Moody, Fitch, and S&P. Back in the day in finance, when they were giving AAA ratings to mortgage-backed securities, they were selling them to the investment banks using models that only the investment banks knew about. And that was, of course, quite corrupt because of the business model itself. And to Deb's point, it would be far better for second-party auditors like myself to be forced to sort of publicly describe what are the audits that we're doing, right? I would love to insist on that. I would love to have the leverage for that. I do not have the leverage for that. And the reason is exactly what Deb said, which is that we don't have enough regulators that are on the ball. We don't have enough lawsuits, plaintiff or class action lawsuits, to exert pressure to these companies, even the ones that are theoretically, under regulation, like insurance or credit or hiring or other things. Even the ones that are theoretically regulated, they do not actually have that much pressure to make sure their algorithms are working well. So I am left as a second party auditor trying to understand how their algorithms work, in large part to help the regulators make those standards. So long story short, I want what Deb wants. But I will just finish by saying that I think we're not there yet. And I think what the analogy I like to draw is this. It's like you go into a cockpit of an airplane and you see all those dials and you're like, someone spent a lot of time figuring out what the dials should say and how many dials there should be. And the dials in an airplane are different from the dials in a train, in the engineering booth in a train, because when they came up with the technology of flight, they were like, there's different risks and there's different things we have to keep track of. And there's different monitoring systems. There's a different dashboard of metrics that we had to make sure we're okay in order for this flight to be safe. And what we're doing now, what we're in the stage of now is designing the cockpit. the airplanes, and the airplanes here are the AI systems that are high stakes. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, I'd love to have a standard algorithmic audit for something like an insurance product, but we haven't actually figured out what that looks like. We don't know what the dials are. We don't know what the monitors are. We don't know what the standard audit should be yet. And that is a lot of work that we're going to have to do. Once we do it, I would love to see really good high standards for the audits, and paid for by some kind of massive fund that the companies that are audited have to pay into, which Deb didn't mention, but that is part of her paper, and I think it's an important point. And I'll stop there because I know this is a discussion.
Great, thank you. DJ, take it away.
Well, the first, I want to thank Deborah for putting pen to paper. It's not easy, and I hope that no one's going to interpret these comments as just criticism. I think it's very easy to throw stones at a proposal, and that's just very hard. And apologies for the leaf blower. That, of course, only can happen when you turn on your mic. There's a couple things that I would offer up is where my head goes in some of the things that I think about in this aspect. And I work in very regulated fields, including healthcare. And so I get to see some of the different aspects of audits and other things. And the first thing is that I think about is, how do we accomplish the goal while ensuring that we don't have suffocating regulatory burden? I think there's some regulatory burden is appropriate, but how do we ensure it's not suffocating? In particular, how do we ensure that it works for companies of all sizes, or does not entrench one sector or company versus another? In the case of healthcare, for example, it's very easy to have a lot of the regulatory burden that prevents any innovation from taking place. And we've seen that additionally with the processes required to even bring new products in to support government. You have to go through FedRAMP, being FedRAMP certified. That could cost you $1 million, $2 million just to start. And so companies will not show up to bring their products, even if they're superior to others. And so how do we do that? One of the challenges I have in figuring out what is the appropriate form of an impact assessment, whether it's federal, state, or companies, is how do we make sure that it is agile? How does it adapt? How do we also simultaneously think about the speed and cost it takes to do that? And we've seen environmental impact assessments that can take extraordinary amounts of time, cost, and then we start back from square one every once in a while. And then when I think about oversight boards, I think there's a lot of interesting ideas around that. And I want to wonder, how can we ensure that we ensure it's not a political process? We know that if we're going to create something that is done by legislation, it's going to have 3 people maybe chosen by Democrats, 3 chosen by Republicans in Congress, 1 picked goes, by the party in power who owns the presidency. How do we ensure that that's not just going to be political and something that just regresses and gets us into gridlock, given the things that are at stake? And then the other portion is, I think, as Deborah said, is there's lots of great analogies. There is what we've seen with FAA and what we've seen with FDA. And we also have seen extraordinary, and I have personally received many of those criticisms about where we've seen those processes not evolve and have not kept up. And then the final thing is, I would point out, Hillary Mason, Mike Lujitas, and I attempted to take some of these ideas and ask, how could we implement them in our companies, in our organizations? What we came back with is some of the things that I think we can do that try to change a culture, because regulation is not going to just change the culture. And so what would it look like if we had something like EFF have a whistleblower kind of protection type thing that would act more like an ombudsperson? Is there something that we could have so it doesn't have to get the direct shining light immediately? And maybe that's warranted over time, but that you could build this into a collaborative process, kind of like what we've seen with FAA. Could we have something in healthcare where there is a compliance person or ethics person that sits outside of reporting duties to the CEO and reports to the chairperson? Obviously, it doesn't work if the chairperson and the CEO are the same. And I think these sessions are so important because as Cathy said, we got to think about this. Fiona's done a lot of work in this also. Is we got to get groups together to start discussions and hashing it out and stress testing these ideas. So I appreciate everyone bringing their whole selves and energy to this.
Fantastic. Deb, did you want to just have a quick reaction to these comments?
Yeah, thanks both for those amazing comments. I guess I wanted to like clarify a couple of things in response to DJ's comments in particular. I think that I often hear a bit of sort of ambiguity with respect to the relationship between impact assessments and audits, where impact assessments have sort of, especially algorithmic impact assessments, have sort of gained mainstream dominance as sort of this interesting policy agenda around, can we properly articulate the different ways in which the introduction of this algorithm will sort of impact the broader ecosystem of, whatever bureaucratic process or whatever, particular outcome. And I think that impact assessments are definitely important tools, but a lot of work, I think there's been recent work by Data and Society and recent work by legal scholars like Andrew Selfs that have looked at the fact that impact assessments are ultimately often operating as internal audits more than external audits. So they're often executed by the institution, either making use or hoping to make use of the algorithm, or they're implemented by the vendor itself or provided by the vendor itself. And that is very different from an audit, especially a third-party audit, where it really is geared towards specifically evaluation, this sort of quantification of the difference between the expectation of what the system is supposed to do and the reality of where the system is. And that's a much more precise definition or goal of what the auditor is doing than an impact assessment, which has been sort of traditionally very ambiguous and can kind of, like you mentioned, grow into this thing of a multi-year process, in addition to being this very scope thing of a couple months. Like, it's a very sort of ill-defined sort of corpus, and as a result of that, it can kind of be interpreted in various ways, whereas an audit, I think, is a little bit more of a grounded process and tends to be more specific towards evaluation. And there are definitely, I know, like Cathy, for example, a lot of the work Orca does is very procedural as well. It's not just specific to, getting to an end result or auditing a particular outcome. You guys also sort of engage in these sort of assessments of sort of, processes in place and evaluating if the practice of the org is aligned, in addition to the outcomes of the algorithm being aligned with expectations. But I do think ultimately, like, audits are a little bit more scoped and also much more geared towards evaluation and how that integrates into accountability outcomes. So I wanted to like articulate that difference. But to your point around, practically, how does something like an oversight board happen? Like, who is actually going to take responsibility? Someone needs to step up at some level. The way I try to set up, and like something I try to set up with the analogies, is that there's actually a lot of opportunity through these analogies to extend some of the accountability infrastructures that already exist and just apply that to the algorithmic context as well. So for example, like, I think a lot about how the FTC has certain investigative powers and inspection powers, or the FDA already has certain inspection powers. What would it mean for them to also consider the reality of the fact that there's a lot of, let's say for the FDA, algorithmic tools now being used in the medical space? Like, how have they been able to accommodate that? And if they haven't, and like I mentioned, a lot of regulators haven't really been thinking about how algorithms are going to affect their particular domain. And since they haven't, why don't they provide, or why don't they share some of these inspection powers through a vetting process with other sort of third parties that are qualified to take that role and to do that inspection work on their behalf? It's like a similar sort of ideology to the auditing organizations that I mentioned in the medical device space, where you can't have, a healthcare department, or, I'm Canadian, so I'm thinking of Health Canada, but the FDA, you don't necessarily need to hire individuals at the FDA that are experts in terms of assessing every type of medical device. You can actually outsource that that inspection to a set of qualified auditing organizations that you appoint, that you assess according to your standards of what qualifications are required and what levels of independence are required. And then you kind of give them the work to be able to do that. And I think that in the proposal, it is very, the initial vision was for an auditing oversight board that could sort of exist across domains. But I think, if the FTC or the FDA wanted right now to sort of come up with a board within their own agency to sort of delegate, the subset of issues related to algorithmic development and algorithmic tools, like that's something that could definitely happen very quickly. Sort of like a localized version of the broader audit oversight board that could exist. But I think this plays to what Cathy was saying around standards. Like it's just very difficult to do any of this when there hasn't really been a clear conversation around what it means to do a good audit, and to not fall into the trap, like she mentioned, of finance, where not only what does it mean to do a good audit, but what does it mean to actually be an independent auditor, and what are you allowed to do or not allowed to do? Sort of this meta accountability issue that exists.
Yeah. Let me jump in for a second, because one of my favorite parts of your talk was the persistent return to analogies and the ways that we already do this in society.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's incredibly important. It's easy to fall into the trap that I think many platforms would like us to fall into, that this is all very complicated and it's rocket science, it's really hard and so on. Whereas in fact, automobiles are very dangerous and we have ways to regulate them and make them safer. And this just isn't different in that same way.
Yeah.
And therefore, a lot of the powers ought to already exist. And we just simply need to recognize these are dangerous or biased or causing discrimination in a way that's already outlawed. So I think that's a more productive direction. I also think that while academics can spend a lot of time saying, let's analyze this really meta subject and let's try to make it perfect and let's worry about the things that DJ was talking about, can we get good people from the government to do it? Won't this extra regulatory burden inhibit creativity and innovation? That those are the perfect being the enemy of the good very often. And you often are going to see the parties that benefit. Why do we have these algorithms and problems? Because someone's making money. They're not generally out there just trying to cause social upheaval. They're doing it for a profit motive. So that means that they're going to work pretty hard to keep those profits, which means that they're going to pile up reasons why it's very necessary to have a perfect system rather than before launching.
Good enough. Yeah.
I think that's something to keep in the back of, all of the academics should keep that in the back of their mind, because I think that can sometimes get in the way of useful progress. I'll stop there and I think Cathy had her hand up a minute ago.
Yeah. And I just want to, I love the car. I use the car analogy as well. The thing is about cars is that like people died there by the side of the road. And we can see, oh, that person fell through the windshield. Oh, people who sit in the back seat aren't as endangered. Oh, we should put kids in the back seat. Oh, car seats help. Like we saw this in a kind of very concrete way, but these are questions we don't ask of algorithms, right? So to Deb's point, like impact analysis, actually, I would argue is what I do because I don't know how people are harmed, where the harms live, and therefore I haven't designed the monitors in the cockpit because I don't know like what the monitor should be measuring. I don't know like I should be measuring, is there a seatbelt? Is there, an airbag or whatever? I'm mixing metaphors here, but you understand what I'm saying. So like the impact assessment is absolutely required because, well, from my perspective, it's just asking who's harmed here. And that's like who are the stakeholders? What is the impact of the stakeholders? When is it bad? But to DJ's point, I really think it's important to understand that like designing a cockpit is a lot of work. And it should be done, the burden of it should be borne by the large companies making a lot of money, to Fiona's point. And then it should be sort of a minimal viable audit should be taken on by the regulators, and they should insist that everyone does it. But by the time they've done that, that's a lot less work. You're saying like, here are the tests you have to run. You have to report these every quarter or every month or whatever it is, or on an ongoing basis. That's actually a lot less work for the smaller companies. And I think we should see it that way, that like there's a startup cost, there's a transition cost that should be worked out between the regulators and the larger players. And then once it's sort of been defined, it should be distributed to everyone. That's my 2 cents.
So I think like, there's a lot of like focus on, I guess another way of like interpreting the proposal though, is that, because I guess one of my concerns around allowing the companies to participate in defining audit standards in any capacity is because the companies have sort of already proven that they are willing to engage in a lot of sort of deceptive practice to like disguise the extent to which these systems fail. Like the way in which AI capabilities are exaggerated means that companies will sometimes like, and Cathy, you've experienced this when they'll agree to release information or release code, be like completely unreadable because there's just, there's no data dictionary, there's no definition of the variables, or they'll, and this is what Facebook has done many times in a settlement with the ACLU, they will make all these claims about how they're going to adjust the algorithm. And then if you reevaluate them externally, and then they'll sort of release internal reports about how they've made these changes. But then when you evaluate them externally, you find that they haven't actually made those changes, which is what happened with their ad delivery algorithm for housing. So I do think like, I don't actually think we need the companies to cooperate in any capacity. Like I'm very-
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
It's costly to do this. So I'm with Cathy on the following front. Put the costs onto the large corporations to set it up and do it. But then your point is the government, the regulator has to be able to come in and see everything and double check and be able to back it, because then it will be done in a non-deceptive manner if it can be done by somebody who's a third party.
Sorry.
Another example. Sorry, Deb, but I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with both Fiona and you, and I'll just give you the setup I'm thinking about. Like when I work with AGs, they try to go after big players who can afford the work. And the work is, in that case, is like they have to hire a lawyer, they have to give us the data, they have to deal with us. Mm-hmm. And we're being paid by the AGs, but not by them, but it's still a burden on them. But the point is that like, here's the current situation. There was a payday lender that I am allowed to talk about, that I computed the effective APR in the state of Illinois, which has a usury rate of 36%. Their effective APR is 500%. Like I showed one graph to the judge. I mean, the judge got to see one scatter plot and was like, okay, this is illegal, give restitution. And that was great. There was a rule that was broken. That rule then somehow disappeared into the ether, only to be rediscovered next time a payday lender does something awful. Like, why isn't that a rule that they always have to, that every payday lender has to prove on an ongoing basis that they are following? And similarly, Deb, like, yes, they shouldn't really get to say what the rules are that they're going to have to pass, right? But the point is that they will have to hand over the data to show whether or not they're failing or passing the tests.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to get at is that part of the motivation for this proposal is about minimizing the amount of opportunity companies have in terms of dictating anything about the level of accountability they have to experience. So right now, even as an external auditor, you're completely beholden to how the company reacts to your audit. Like they have full choice to, like persecute you because you access the information incorrectly, or even like ignore the result completely. Like everything is in the company's hands right now. And I think that like, a lot of the policy interventions I hear are attempts to sort of manage corporate behavior. So even, some of these internal audit proposals like GDPR is like, data protection impact assessment, for example, is something that the companies have to do. So there's a lot of policy right now, AI policy, that's very focused on updating corporate behavior. Oh, what can we do to sort of mandate that companies act in a particular way? And I think something that I'm trying to say is that I definitely think we need regulation to control corporate behavior, but there's also this group of people that have already been doing a lot of this accountability work. Can we also have regulation to just protect them and to support them to be able to do their work? Do we actually need corporate participation in order for, or corporate cooperate? Like, do we need like the corporations to agree or to sort of, do we need corporate cooperation in order to protect, to give third-party auditors legal immunity from like legal retaliation? I don't think we need corporations in order to do that, right? So I'm trying to like figure out like, is there a way to sort of reframe the AI policy conversation where it's less focused on, dictating what a company should or shouldn't do, and it's more focused on sort of protecting and supporting external actors that are already doing the work to be able to do their work more effectively and to be able to do more work or better work, really.
I mean, I don't want to hog the floor, but I will say absolutely we need both. We need both. Like we need.
He's just silently sitting there. I'm not sure.
We need academic researchers to be able to access Facebook at all levels, at every single level, to understand how our democracy is at stake. And yet, I still feel like you're never going to get the rules that insurance companies should be following on internal policies by activism. It's too deep, and we still need to figure out rules for that. So we have to do both. That's my theory.
Okay.
EJ, do you have a theory?
Well, I guess what I'm struggling with is it spans so many different areas. It's a little hard to kind of narrow it down. Like maybe what comes to my mind is, I think I've spent a lot of time with FDA. I've spent a lot of time recently around COVID and the state systems, both on the direct public health and delivery of benefits. And what I see a lot of times is you've got, and Cathy points this out a lot in her book also, is that you've got a lot of these small actors and a lot of algorithms, a lot of systems where it's everyone's spread extraordinarily thin. If we think about the FDA in itself, just as an FDA and their ability to regulate their just pharmaceutical drugs, we're in a very bad spot right now on their ability to execute. I mean, we've hollowed out an institution.
Okay. The FDA is a failed agency that is just a disaster in every way. I don't think
I wouldn't go that far to say it's failed agency. I still trust my drugs.
That's another conference.
Our thing, but.
Oh. I think
he's frozen for me too. Anyway, I think the algorithms are the least of the FDA's problems, but I'm perfectly prepared to believe that algorithms are also a problem.
Yeah, I think they're also a problem in addition of. Oh, I think he is frozen. Oh no.
All right, well, we've got 10 minutes or so left. I don't know if the two of you can see the questions that have come in. Do you want to pick up the transparency idea? We haven't really talked very much about that, and Frances Haugen was quite big on, I thought she was quite clever in not saying, here's the rule I want for the algorithm. Let's have a regulator that just has a lot of transparency so we can all see what's happening. And I'm with her when it comes to algorithms creating anorexia. I feel like it's pretty clear to society that that's bad. And if you make that transparent, you'll get a reaction. I'm not sure if transparency goes further than that. What do you two think about that tool?
Yeah, so I think it's a mechanism towards accountability. Like I was mentioning, a lot of third parties struggle with access and with transparency because they have the goal of leveraging that transparency to be able to execute on these evaluations and these assessments that can then be sort of leveraged as evidence of a particular harm being perpetuated, whether it be bias or functional failure or other types of violations or concerns. So I do think that transparency sort of plays this role of, facilitating scrutiny and providing an opportunity for external scrutiny in a way that can lead to the kind of evidence you need to hold different stakeholders accountable. So it's only as useful as like the people, leveraging that information.
It's low-hanging fruit, but it's not going to get us all the way there.
Yeah, it's not going to get us all the way there for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask one more about what do you think would incentivize and drive more cooperative algorithmic audits? A recent example is the independent audit of the startup company Pymetrics candidate screening tool.
Yeah. I think, is it for me or just for, I guess, for
Either of
whoever?
you.
Okay. I don't know, Cathy, if you want to speak. I've been speaking a lot.
I mean, those will happen when companies are willing to let them happen, right? But the point is that unfortunately, it's certainly there's no leverage to make that happen, and it is, a choice of the people who do let it happen. And sometimes it's PR move. Sometimes it's a really true, earnest attempt to do as well as possible. And I should say that, like, a lot of my clients, and I'm with you, Deb, I don't really trust corporations, but a lot of my clients are calling me because they can't sleep at night and they want to make sure that they're working for a company that they trust. So there are also people within these companies that are trustworthy, and we need them, because we need them to explain to us what's actually happening in the real world. There's no reason for them to tell us. There's no law that they need to tell us. So it's really important. DJ's back.
Yep,
Maybe
DJ, why don't you finish that thought that you were in the middle of when the internet?
Sorry, I was trying to figure out where our Comcast outage is. We've got a little something unstable. I think that I don't want to derail from you obviously all carried on forward is the thing that I think about is the actual implementation of these things. And one of the things I would say is one of the big efforts that you've perhaps seen in the Biden and Harris administration is this idea of this concept of delivery, which is how do we actually take policies and execute them? And one of the things that's being attempted to be done in that process is, because things have such an algorithmic nature, is to drive a better thinking and openness around these things. But it's going to require a large collective action for that to happen, not only of technologists, but academics, everybody, activists, everyone coming to help on this. And I think it's early days. So that's why I kind of highlight and I gear towards more of these aspects, because we are trying to right-save these agencies and figure these things out.
Fiona, if you don't mind, can I ask you to weigh in on this? I mean, you have a lot of experience with actual regulation, actually working or not.
Yeah, I think that, right now we have a Congress that's not going to do anything. And so all of us can say, isn't this terrible? It's causing harm, et cetera, et cetera. But that there aren't going to be any new powers given here, because corporations make money doing this, and they go to the Congress or the Senate and they pay and they get the laws they want. So I'm not really optimistic that we get a law. So I think the way you got to think about this is what existing laws are out there, and analogizing to, we don't worry about harm from buggy whips anymore. So, but the statutes of harm are still there, and we move on to algorithms. I mean, we invent planes, we worry about harm from planes. We invent cars, we worry about harm from cars. So I think we have to use what we have. And then the second thing is that if you can put a lot of the burden onto corporations in a standardized way, tell them what's expected and say there can't be discrimination. We expect you to do internal audits, you report them once a quarter. You then have a lot more, I think, buy-in from courts, that if a corporation is covering up something or doing it wrong or failing to put in appropriate resources, and they're saying to the government everything's fine when it's not, that's a very different liability posture than you were running your business and oops, accidentally something happened. So I think putting the burden, as much of the burden as you can on the corporation, but again, being sensitive to this entry and competition issue. We don't want burdens to be so high that nobody little can ever get started in a business. So we have to be sensitive, I think, also to saying, well, harm is going to be bigger when the corporation's bigger and has more users and affects more people. And so we're going to have a standard for that entity that's different than a startup. And maybe we give the startup a break, not to say there can't be harmful startups, but that if we want entry and challenging, we want to challenge on the basis of quality, better service. We want entry. And if they're doing problematic stuff, then we're going to catch them when they grow. So those would be a few principles that I think are helpful to getting going in a hostile environment.
I have like a follow-up question, Fiona, around, some of these proposals are not necessarily, there's not like a legal mandate necessary for these proposals to happen. So something like an audit oversight board is like an action that a federal agency can take on their own. So regardless of how efficient or inefficient Congress is, do you feel like there's specific aspects of this proposal or other proposals that could actually be pushed forward independent of,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's exactly why I like it so much, because you have all these analogies that agencies have authority. They can say, this is an unfair method of competition. This is deception. This is discrimination. And we have rules about that. And the way we're going to advance progress is by setting up some internal to our agency system. And that's the executive branch. And the executive branch is interested in fixing some of this.
Okay.
So I think absolutely that's the direction to push right now, executive actions.
To Fiona's point, there's nothing that prevents the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of Commerce or Secretary of Transportation from saying, we're going to do this under procurement rules.
Yeah.
And establish these things. We're about to have a lot of money flowing to the Department of Transportation, especially in a connected transportation framework. They could easily put this into the rule set and have the courage to do it at the agency level. And I would love to see an example of that, so that then the agencies act as experiments.
Exactly.
And they have the ability to be more agile as they update the procurement rule set.
But remember, if you were going to identify a captured agency other than the FDA, which is also one of my favorites, the Department of Transportation and the Department of Agriculture are right up there. So we have to tell them, no, the point of this money is not to enrich airlines. The point of this money is to protect all of us from whatever it is. So the executive order, Biden's executive order on competition is a really good one, but also thinking about anti-racism and generally social justice is another good one to just keep repeating. So Eric,
not to get nitty gritty, but I'll just add one thing about executive orders, because I agree with Fiona on the EO front. My experience with EOs, executive orders, has been you need still someone who's going to push, because just because you have an EO, it doesn't get the bureaucracy. It gives an excuse for the bureaucracy to do the right thing, but it doesn't make the bureaucracy do the right thing, unfortunately, as much as we would like.
Agreed.
Well, DJ, yeah, you've had some experience with that. I wanted to get some of the questions in from the audience, and we have a number of them here in Slido. So I'll just read a few of them here. Here's one from Sasha Costanza Chalk. She asks, could you talk more about the difference between incident reporting like PAI, which is focused on news reports, and harms reports like AJLs, focused on those who can experience harm, and why are both needed? I think it's mainly for you, Deb, but any of you may want to weigh in.
Yeah, so I think there's already a set of tools out there of people sort of tracking the different incidents that have been happening with respect to AI deployment. So the incident report is sort of really stories that have already made their way into the press or have sort of escalated to viral status on social media, and that gets logged through the PAI database. And there's also, like I mentioned, the algorithm tips tool that is used by a lot of investigative journalists, and it's really it's a transparency tool to just list out all the different algorithmic deployments by public agencies, and it's a tool for journalists to sort of try to find leads of different algorithms to investigate. And that's kind of different from this concept of harms discovery or harms reporting, where you actually have, in the case of AJL, we actually have, like firsthand accounts of different individuals that perceive that they've been harmed by an algorithm, or maybe their legal representation contacting us for support in terms of, expert testimony or something like that. So the main difference is really one, focusing on the harm and not just the existence of an algorithm in a particular context, but really trying to map out that a harm has occurred versus just mapping out that there's the presence of an algorithm in a situation that was harmful, and tying it into this person or this individual or institution seeking justice as a result of that. So it's a lot more of like an actionable frame. And it's also, I guess, useful in that way for target identification for auditing.
And if I could follow up with another question from the audience that I think relates directly to this, the proposal, I think, sort of says that sort of audit authorities of existing governmental regulatory bodies should be increased. And how practical is it to believe that these bodies currently have or could access the kind of talent that they would need to competently execute on these responsibilities? I think it's probably most closely related to the kinds of concerns that I think DJ has articulated so well.
Yeah.
So if you could, if any of you could kind of weigh in on that, I think that'd be helpful to hear.
Yeah, I have thoughts, but I don't want to hog the mic. I can respond briefly, and then maybe others can.
That's why we put you on the spot, Deb.
I was like, I've been talking
Welcome
for a
to the
while.
spotlight.
But yeah, I was gonna say, like, I definitely think that one of the reasons why I find it really interesting to sort of extend privileges, access privileges, but perhaps other privileges as well, enforcement privileges I mentioned towards the end, to other third-party actors beyond regulators is because of this capacity issue. So this is also a reason why, or the main excuse a lot of companies don't want to release information to regulators, because they're stating that, oh, we actually do a really good job protecting these people's privacy, and we have like all these security measures, and I don't know if a lot of regulators even have like a backend engineer maintaining the database, much less adding security and privacy features to the database. So, can a regulator really hold the information that the company, if the company was to provide if Facebook was to provide regulators with full access to their system, how would we guarantee that the regulator would, have all the security and privacy measures that the Facebook engineers have already established for that data, right? So there's a lot of that tension that exists when people ask for regulators to be given access. I think there's a couple interesting ideas out there, and a lot of these ideas have kind of come out of conversation. The EU Commission has sort of drafted this Digital Services Act, and there's a couple articles in there that are related to this idea of independent auditing, and some interesting conversations have come out of that where people have said, well, it's not like access is a 0-1. It's not a 0-0-1 sort of game of, it's everything or nothing. There's sort of intermediary opportunities where maybe the way that access can be mediated is through request. So maybe the regulator doesn't have the technical capacity to host all of the information of a particular organization or company, but they would be able to demand or request an engineer to be able to give them certain types of information. There's also maybe a framework where they can contract or delegate, like I mentioned in the proposal, certain investigations to external third-party auditors, or recruit through a bounty or other means to facilitate interest in addressing that particular investigation. But again, the vetting process has to happen, and that's why the Audit Oversight Board is such an essential component of the proposal.
I think that it's really important not to say we're only going to do algorithmic oversight when we can get the best talent in the government, because we know we live in America where we don't give the government enough money remotely to do that. So there has to be a setup where we employ the civil society and nonprofits to come in and visit or to check up exactly like a board, and that what the government does is require these whatever standards that get checked up on by other people.
Yeah.
Cathy, you had your hand up and I interrupted.
Yeah, no, you didn't interrupt. Thank you. I will just say that as somebody who talks to regulators all the time, number one, they don't currently have the capacity. Number two, there's absolutely a lot of people who want to work on this stuff. They really do. And number three, like I keep on, and this is something that maybe probably where I disagree with Deb the most, but like I think we're in spirit agree.
We can disagree.
Yeah, we absolutely we must burden the people that make money off these algorithms. So for example, I keep on hearing this idea that like we could institute a requirement that if like a government agency licenses an algorithm, that the person it needs to be vetted. right? And like that, it needs to be, the vetting needs to be supplied essentially by that third party. So they have to make the case, i.e., they have to make the case that what they're doing is fair and legal. And to Fiona's point, that would not finish the job, because they would probably come up with a crappy way of doing that, but it would reduce their plausible deniability, which, by the way, is the single biggest reason I don't get clients in my second party auditing firm companies, because they don't want to know the answer and they don't think they have to. So the point is that if they make a requirement that they actually have to at least pretend to know the answer to some of these questions, that would be a big step forward.
Yeah, but just to like summarize and answer Dan's point, I think it's about broadening the scope of participation, right? Like the regulators should not be bearing the full front of the work in terms of acquiring that information and doing all the analysis and then leveraging towards accountability. Like all steps should not be executed purely by the regulator. That's a lot to ask. And I think like where Cathy and Fiona kind of agree, and maybe DJ, but I don't want to speak for him, is around this idea of just broadening the scope of participation to include other third parties, but also, like you mentioned, Cathy, maybe give some of the labor to the corporations themselves as well.
We're just about out of time here, so just a quick answer from any of you, but especially you, Deb. And as an economist, I'll pick one of the questions that deals with incentives. The question is, the proposal calls for transparency of audit results. I see a lot of virtues in that, but what do the critics say who worry about innovation effects? Audits could divulge sensitive information and undercut innovation incentives, enabling spying on competitors.
Yeah, I hear this a lot. I think there's, like I mentioned earlier, I don't think access is a zero-sum game. I think it's definitely a situation where you can have, the final slide I talk about having a centralized database of audit results, similar to like, the SEC's database of corporate filings and things like that. But it might not necessarily need to be publicly accessible, just because, especially as part of algorithmic audits, there at times does need to be access to data and information that could be protected under intellectual property. So it could be a situation where the database is there and it's visible to certain regulators that have access, and the public can maybe request to view, and then those applications are vetted, similar to a FOIA request. But the fact that the information is within a public institution where there's that opportunity for a FOIA request type relationship versus that information just locked within a private institution that like has no sort of opportunity or mechanism for public access, I think is a huge difference, where it doesn't need to be published publicly, but there's a lot of these sort of intermediary options that we can think about when reflecting on how to release this information. If it's made if it's centralized within a public database and made accessible to regulators, there's still a lot of opportunity for that to be leveraged towards broader accountability and provide the public an avenue to be able to access if they really, really want to.
Well, I think we're going to have to call that a wrap. We are at time, but thank you so much, Deb, DJ, Cathy, and Fiona for joining us for this really terrific panel. We really appreciate it. With that, I think Eric and I just wanted to offer thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. We wanted to just offer a few concluding thoughts to this conference with a few points. First, it's been a terrific set of discussions over the past 2 days. We've covered a lot of terrain. We've gone from Louis Brandeis's trust busting to questions about what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. really meant, whether it was universal basic income or guaranteed income, to data ownership and whether data ownership is even a coherent and constitutional principles, to questions about the fragility of humanity as exposed by research on platform misinformation. And while we've covered all that terrain, in many ways, the proposals are tackling and trying to wrestle with common problems. Data cooperatives are trying to take the perceived windfalls and redistribute them to consumers or data producers by contract or license, much like how UBI is trying to work through the tax system to try to engage in that form of kind of redistribution. And algorithmic auditing is trying to make clear what algorithmic harms might be through a kind of informational intervention, much like intermediaries attempt to empower consumers to choose based on the quality, not solely the price of products. And second, I think the goal of this conference that Eric and I have had in mind all along has been to move the dialogue with these concrete, radical proposals. In the words of DJ, really the goal is to begin to stress test some of these really important ideas. And we recognize that what is radical is really in the eye of the beholder. Some will say that these proposals are too pie in the sky. But if there's one thing that Andrew Yang's political presence has shown us is how much the so-called Overton window, the part of the policy space that appears politically acceptable at a given moment, can shift through the agency of specific individuals. Yet others will say these proposals are not radical enough, and that's of course fine. What we've tried to do here is to move toward concrete proposals precisely because the AI governance debate has been a little bit stuck in abstractions. And if we can push forward concrete proposals to solve these wicked problems, we're all ears. Third, we want to thank all of the presenters for putting forth and engaging with these big ideas in such spirited and impactful ways. This event would not have been possible without the help from a large range of folks. So we did want to at least note the amazing people who have made this event possible. The high events team, Celia Clark and Casey Peel, the policy team, Russell Wald, Mike Solito, and Tina Wang, the communications team, Stacey Pena, Shayna Lynch, and Janina Kazuzzi, and all the high fellows and Christy Coe and Christine Zhang, who helped with the proposal selection, and the fantastic Stanford video team and Gordon Gurley, who've helped to make all of this possible, and many other amazing high staff members who have helped to make this event come together.
Thanks, Dan. And to wrap up, Dan and I want to end with a call to action. We've both been to more conferences than we can count, probably like most of you. And while we love to hear smart people weighing in on the big topics of the day and enumerating all the problems we face, what we love even more is hearing solutions. We're mindful optimists, and we believe that we can build a better society, but that it won't happen automatically, that it takes concrete action. And that's why we tried something different with this conference. Last spring, we publicly solicited radical solutions for a better society. And as we hoped, we got dozens and dozens of thoughtful proposals. We read them all, and we picked 4 to be presented over the past couple of days. And we also sought to include, as you heard, a diverse set of experts to comment on them from different perspectives. And now that the conference is done, I can say that we were delighted with what we heard over the past 2 days. I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. But this conference was not meant to be the last word on these topics. Our goal is to start a conversation, or really a set of conversations. And we want to get them started in a concrete way that provokes not only deep thinking, but real action. And so we hope to see action on these 4 proposals and on the other ways that we may be able to grapple with the rise of AI and build a better economy and society. So we encourage you to engage with these proposals, to reflect on the ideas, debate them with your friends and your family and your colleagues, but don't stop there. Join organizations to help improve and promote and enact them. Contact your representatives and other policymakers. You heard Eric Lander invite you to comment on it. In fact, the OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, has scheduled 6 listening sessions. I hope you'll go to them and give your advice. We just put the link in Slido so you can easily find those. I'm going to make it as easy as possible for you guys to do your homework. And don't be afraid to suggest a radical new idea yourself. Sometimes a radical solution is exactly what's needed to harness the power of radical new technologies. And whether your own radical proposal gets enacted or not, simply stating it is one way that you can shift the Overton window. That's how we open people's minds to what new ideas are even fair game to consider. We sincerely hope you enjoyed this conference, and we want to hear how we can improve. So for all those who registered, you'll receive a survey the next day or two asking your opinions on what worked well and what we could do better. And if you want to rewatch this conference video, or if you want to learn more about HI and our work or attend other events, you can visit our website at hi.stanford.edu or follow us on our social media channels. There's also a mail list you can join that's also posted in Slido now, I believe. And we have more activities in the pipeline. Just next week, we have a conference on data-centric AI. Our spring conference is already scheduled. That's April 12th and 13th, so mark your calendars. It's going to be co-chaired by Faith A. Lee and Chris Manning. To sum up, I think the next decade can be one of the best decades that humanity has ever experienced, but only if we remember that humans had the agency, not technology. At Stanford High, we're working to fulfill the potential of human-centered AI, and we hope the proposals you've heard over the past 2 days have inspired you to join in that mission. So thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to working with you going forward.